We're going to get started only 5 minutes late, which is actually pretty good, so thanks for coming and getting settled. So my name is Josh Galperin, and I'm the Associate Director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and you are all here for part of our year-long speaker series. We have sort of two parallel tracks in the speaker series. One is our bookshelf series, where we bring in authors. Matt Hoffmann actually is an author, but he's also here for the other track, where we've been exploring novel and creative climate policies. So some of you may have seen in the fall that we had Peter Lehner and James Cameron come to campus to talk about different aspects of how to address the climate problem, from focusing more on agriculture as a wedge issue to the bottom-up governance that James Cameron spoke about. So tonight we have Professor Matt Hoffmann from the University of Toronto. I want to say a couple things about Matt before I also mention another event that you should think about attending coming up later this week. I've had this opportunity to introduce a lot of speakers in the last several years that I've been here. Matt is the only one I've actually known before he arrived on campus. So Matt was my professor of political science and my advisor as an undergraduate at the University of Delaware. He is now at the University of Toronto, which is a shame for the University of Delaware, which I still have more of an allegiance to than Toronto. But it's good for Canada, and good for Toronto, of course. So I'm really excited to have Matt here, and I'm really excited that he's working on something that is right in line with the kind of work we're doing and the kind of speakers we're trying to bring in. So I don't want to say a lot about Matt's work, except to say that, as I mentioned, he has written a book, which is Climate Governance at the Crossroads. And what it focuses on is sort of the early stages, I think, of what he's going to talk more about tonight, which is catalyzing political pathways to hopefully better climate governance. So we've talked about bottom-up approaches, as I said. We've talked about the agriculture as an approach, and we're talking about many other approaches, climate finance, metrics, and so forth. But the idea of this project, which Matt will describe in real detail, is to think about how we get politics changing, not just not the specific actions and the specific mechanisms that we're using to address climate, but the political processes. Hopefully that was more or less
great.
So I'm going to let him tell you more about that, but before I do, I just want to mention that there's going to be tomorrow, where did I put these notes? See, this is an event that I haven't organized, so I want to make sure I get the details right. So tomorrow there's going to be a high-level panel of academics and practitioners talking about climate governance in the U.S. The title of the panel is The Future of U.S. Climate Advocacy. And it's going to be at 6 p.m. in Bowers. 6 p.m. It is tomorrow, is that right, Ben?
Right.
Yeah, 6 p.m. tomorrow in Bowers. And I'm going to tell you who the folks on the panel are, because they're pretty impressive people. Theda Skocpol, who you've probably all heard of, has made her name in climate politics relatively recently. Barry Rabe, Peter Barnes, and last but not least, somebody else who I actually happen to know, Abby Dillon, who works for Earth Justice, and who I worked with closely in my previous life, doing more environmental advocacy work. So with that, I want to turn it over to Matt, and thank all of you for joining us.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. It's nice to see Josh, although I realize that you're probably wondering how someone so young could have a student. Josh is 10 years ago. But I'm really pleased to see how well he's doing, and I'm really glad to be here. So what I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about is a project that's ongoing. And so by which I mean don't hold me to the things that I say here, because we're in the year 2 of a 6-year project that we're trying to figure out what we've got up here, catalyzing transformative pathways to decarbonization. And essentially what I want to talk to you today about is how we're trying to make sense of the potential politics of decarbonization. Right? And it's a collaborative project. I'm a PI, and I have a co-PI, Stephen Bernstein, at the University of Toronto, and we've got collaborators from a number of different places, including your own Ben Kishore, and Graham Auld, who's also in the audience, I believe, as well, from Carleton University, as well as some folks at Colorado State, and Durham University in the UK, and Lund and Ottawa University up in Canada. And so essentially what we're talking about is what is the potential on the political side for moving towards broad decarbonization. And I'll spare you the suspense. We don't have the answer yet. Right? We don't have the answer yet. But we have some ideas that are still being worked out, so I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on what we're working on. And so where we start our analysis is what do we need, right? What do we need? We need pathways to decarbonization. Right? Our economy, our energy systems, our transportation systems are all locked into carbon. right? This is a concept that a guy named Unruh put together, this notion of carbon lock-in, right? So we're locked into the carbon system whereby multiple cultural, political, technical, and economic dynamics reinforce the continuing use of fossil fuels, right? So take, for instance, driving, right? Driving is an activity that is locked into the use of fossil fuels. It's a default behavior in most of North America and elsewhere, right? And it's reinforced technically, right? We have significant technology that is sunk into having us use fossil fuels to get around in cars. It's reinforced economically in that we have entire industries and sectors that are based on the production of automobiles that use fossil fuels, in extracting fossil fuels, in setting up filling stations for cars, right? But those are the kind of obvious pieces of lock-in. But it's also locked in culturally, right? With the mythos of the American freedom of using automobiles, right? The growth and value of suburbia is part of locking in fossil fuels and automobility. And even politically, it's locked in. Very few politicians win elections by promising to build fewer roads or make driving more expensive, right? And so, but to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, right, we need to rapidly disrupt carbon lock-in, right? We need to rapidly move towards decarbonization, right? You know, the science varies on this, but sometime in the next decade or so, we need to at least peak, and then we need to move rapidly away from carbon use by 2050. And so if that's what we need pathways to decarbonization, and we need them relatively quickly. The next question we ask ourselves in this project is, well, what do we have to work with, right? If we need decarbonization, what do we have to work with to get there? And there's a couple of traditional answers that are actually not that useful, right? So one of the things we have to work with is the multilateral process, right? This is the traditional notion of what we have to work with, the mega multilateral process. This is a picture from Copenhagen in 2009. My feelings about the utility of the multilateral process should be evidenced by the fact that the most recent photo I have from the one I attended was 2009, right? And let me say, I think that the multilateral process is valuable for a lot of reasons, and I'm happy to get into that in Q&A, but it won't or cannot put us directly and quickly onto a path towards decarbonization, right? Now, last fall, it got a bit of a shot in the arm, right, with the US-China condominium, and sort of one of the major obstacles to the dispute or the debates at the multilateral system seems to have a little more hope now because China and the US are in somewhat moving in the same direction. And an improving environment for treaty making can be good for decarbonization efforts, but not because the international community is going to come to an agreement that sets out the solution to decarbonization, but rather because it can generate momentum that can be taken up at other levels and amongst other initiatives. And again, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the China-US condominium in question and answer if people are interested. But the takeaway here is one of the things we have to work with is multilateral treaty making, but it's not necessarily the solution that we need. Another thing that we have to work with has been more recent. We've seen a number of reports coming mostly from economists that we call, that in our project we think of as solutions-oriented reports, right? So this is the deep decarbonization pathways. There's some stuff coming out of the socio-technical transitions literature. There's the new climate economy report. And these tend to be cost-benefit analysis at a very high level, laying out solutions to move from where we are to where we need to be in terms of solving climate change, right? Or moving towards, in this case, deep decarbonization, right? The problem with this, and I think that these are valuable, they're valuable politically, they're valuable for providing cover, they're valuable for showing that there are economic benefits to be had to working on climate change, that it's not just in the realm of costs to move towards decarbonization, but we can actually think about moving into the realm of benefits from working on decarbonization. But the focus of these kind of reports is on the end state, the notion that we have an end goal of decarbonization, and we can look at the policy prescriptions and show that by cost-benefit analysis, they are viable ways to move ahead. Right? And so in many ways, then, decarbonization in this conceptualization has become a technical enterprise. If we just implement the policies that are laid out in cost-benefit analysis in these reports, we will move towards decarbonization. Now, the problem with this, and again, I think these reports are valuable, and the people that are working on them are smarter than I am, and they're doing incredibly good work, right? But the problem or the disadvantage of this kind of approach is that we don't get an analysis of why some policies might be more palatable than others. We don't get an understanding of how we can actually implement today these solutions that have payoffs in 2050, right? And even further, and I think this is a little bit more philosophical, what these kind of reports ignore is the fact that decarbonization is not a defined goal. Beyond the banal sense that we won't be using fossil fuels, decarbonization is something that we define by what we do, how we don't use fossil fuels, what a society that doesn't use fossil fuels looks like, what an economy that doesn't use fossil fuels looks like, what an energy system that doesn't use fossil fuels looks like. These are all relatively open questions. And further, once we start to try and do things to move towards decarbonization, our understanding of what the end goal is likely to change. Decarbonization, in many ways, is something that we discover along the way. And these kind of reports that have a broad look from 2015 to 2050 do not give that sense of what the pathway, even though this one is called Pathways, what the pathway might be. So the focus of our project is that if we don't really have the multi-layer process to work with, and if this is only a start but doesn't get us far enough along the way, is we think that there's a third thing that we have to work with in towards moving towards decarbonization. And what we've seen in the last 25 years is an enormous explosion of, for lack of a more precise term, climate governance initiatives or experiments. Essentially, all kinds of different actors are starting to take climate change action into their own hands. And so we got things up here like the Copenhagen City Plan and city networks like C40 and the City for Climate Protection. You get NGO corporate alliances like the WWF's Climate Savers program or the Climate Group. You get subnational activity like emissions trading here in the Northeast of the United States in RGGI, right? And so you see a number of initiatives that are working on climate change, trying to move us towards decarbonization in relatively small ways, right? And so what we're trying to do in this project is figure out how we get what we need, decarbonization, from what we think we have to work with. Diverse, globally decentralized interventions that are working on climate change, but are working so in very specific contexts, right? Now, of course, and this is probably a comic most of you have seen, step 2 is the doozy, right? So we know what we have to work with, we know where we need to get to, but step 2 should be a little bit more explicit. And I have to tell you, after working on this for years, I still think a miracle needs to occur, right? And so what we're trying to do in this project is fill in step 2, right? Fill in step 2. And we think that there's 3 parameters for how we could fill in step 2, how this miracle can occur, that we can figure out how we get from experimental, diverse, relatively small scale activities to decarbonization in a broader sense. And the 3 parameters we have for thinking about this is first that this is a political question, right? This is a political question. This is a question of politics, and that political dynamics are crucial. Now, that's probably not too surprising coming from a political scientist, right? I realize I am not talking against interests here, right? But our understanding is that technical innovation is not enough, and the delimitation of cost-effective solutions is not enough. It's political dynamics that make some solutions viable and others not viable, right? Decarbonization, again, is not a preset destination. How decarbonization is understood and how it will be pursued is a political question. And so one of the ways we think about how we get from what we need or how we get from what we have to what we need, is that it's a political pathway. Second is that carbon lock-in is a fractal phenomenon. And that's a really jargony thing, so let me unpack that a little bit. Essentially, we're using the notion of fractal in a metaphorical sense. And fractal systems have a characteristic that what we call self-similarity, right? And so this is a picture of a fractal system. And what that means is that at any level that you look at this picture, it pretty much looks the same, right? So if you look at the whole system, right, it looks very similar to if you just look at this piece of the system, right? And so fractal systems have what we call self-similarity, right? And so what we conceive of is that carbon lock-in, these reinforcing dynamics that make the use of fossil fuels the default action, right, arises because of fractal dynamics. That essentially we don't have, it's nonsensical to talk about global carbon lock-in because there's no global system. There's no global transportation system. There's no global energy system. And yet, it also makes entire sense to say that we have global carbon lock-in because all over the world, we are locked into the use of fossil fuels. And so what this fractal metaphor helps us to think about is that global carbon lock-in and global decarbonization arises from the fact that we have mutually dependent systems that have similar dynamics. So carbon lock-in in the city of Copenhagen, right, is dependent upon global carbon lock-in. For instance, the city of Copenhagen can't suddenly move to a no-carbon transportation system in some ways, right? But that global carbon lock-in happens because the city of Copenhagen is locked into carbon, the state of Denmark is locked into carbon, the city of New York, the state of New York. What you have is mutually dependent systems that have similar dynamics, right? Our global energy, transportation, and economic systems are locked into carbon because transportation, energy, and economic systems at the municipal, provincial, state, and regional levels are locked into carbon, right? And what we think this is both a challenge and an opportunity, right? This is both a challenge and an opportunity. Obviously, if decarbonization is everywhere, the adage is things that are everywhere are nowhere, and it's hard to figure out where to act on things. But because if we're right about it being a fractal system, we can also say that efforts to disrupt carbon lock-in anywhere can have broader effects. So in other words, if you can disrupt carbon lock-in in the city of Copenhagen, that has the potential to start disrupting carbon lock-in in the systems that the city of Copenhagen are embedded in, right? And so we can understand decarbonization. We don't have to think about decarbonization as something that happens all over the globe all at once. We can think about decarbonization as disrupting carbon lock-in in specific contexts, specific places, and think about how that kind of activity can catalyze moves towards decarbonization beyond those specific systems, right? Now, our third parameter for thinking about how we can theorize that miracle is that what we're doing is forward theorizing, right? And this is where the part of the talk where I tell graduate students to not do a study like this, because we are essentially trying to study the future, right? Which is not something that is readily studyable, right? We don't have any successful cases of decarbonization on any meaningful scale, right? If we had decarbonization, this would be much easier. And so what we're trying to do with our understanding is develop a framework that helps make sense of trajectories that interventions are on, that these initiatives are on, and the ways in which they might catalyze broader transformation. And so we're going to look, as I'll talk about a little bit, we're going to look at a diverse set of cases, how they got to where they were, and what's the potential moving forward for them to catalyze decarbonization. And so this is not a classic social science study where we look at some cases of decarbonization, some cases of failed decarbonization, and try and understand the difference between the two so that we understand what conditions get us to decarbonization. Instead, we're looking at a bunch of different interventions that are attempting to disrupt carbon lock-in and try and understand the trajectories that they're on and the processes that they are engendering to see if we can understand a little bit more about what are the potential possibilities for decarbonization. All right, so again, so we're linking what we have to work with what we need. And so we're trying to think about these parameters and understand how decarbonization pathways can be conceptualized and understood. And so in doing this, and for simplicity's sake, what we do is we break down decarbonization potential into a couple of different things, right? So we start with our diverse, globally decentralized interventions, and we say for simplicity's sake that any system that we're thinking about, whether it's a city, whether it's a province or state, a corporate system or national system, is on a trajectory that could be moving in one of these three directions, right? It's a system that could be moving towards reinforced carbon lock-in, right? So that we could be trying to do things, but essentially we fail and we just end up being more locked into carbon use than we were before. It could be moving towards an outcome of improvement, in other words, be a more efficient use of fossil fuels, but not really doing things to get out of the use of fossil fuels. Or we could be moving towards a system transforming. We could be moving towards decarbonization, right? And so our goal is to understand how we get these kind of different trajectories. And again, what we observe empirically has been the emergence of a diverse array of interventions that seek to change the trajectory of specific systems. So we get experiments like C40 that's trying to change the trajectory of 68 of the largest cities in the world. We get carbon labeling efforts that are trying to change the trajectory of corporations in various sectors. We get the climate group, which is trying to change the trajectory of cities by essentially diffusing the norm of smart cities. We even get sort of more traditional policy interventions, like Colorado's new new energy economy, which is trying to disrupt the system or the economy in Colorado. Or the German push for wide-scale use of renewables, trying to disrupt the economy and the energy and transportation systems in Germany, right? And so an intervention for us is this conscious attempt to disrupt a current system state, a new policy, a new municipal climate action plan, deployment of a new technology. And our framework then has to be able to understand, or hopefully make sense of, how the trajectories that these diverse initiatives are on internally, so in other words, is Copenhagen actually moving towards carbon neutrality, but then also how they can catalyze broader trajectories towards decarbonization, right? And so this is a visual representation of our model right now. And so on your left, we have the intervention. So pick your intervention, whether it's C40 or the Copenhagen Municipal Climate Plan or the Climate Group's Smart Cities project, right? And so what we say is that any intervention is going to engender, or has the potential to engender, three kinds of political effects, right? Three kinds of political effects. It alters the state of norms in the system, and so there's normalization around different ways of acting on climate change. It's going to alter the capacity to act in that system in terms of both knowledge and technology. And it's going to alter the political coalitions, political and economic coalitions in that system. Right? So in other words, once you start doing something, there's potential for these kind of political effects and dynamics to get started. So you can get a shift in norms, you get a shift in capacity, you get a shift in coalitions. Right? That once these political dynamics start to occur, what you then see is the intervention itself has the potential to scale up or become more entrenched. And both Graham and Ben will recognize some of this language from their super wicked problems work, right? That if you're able to alter the norms in the system and build capacity and build coalitions, the intervention will get bigger, get more prominent, and will become entrenched in the system that you're looking at. And then from this feedback is how we start to see whether or not you're going to get reinforcement, improvement, or transformation trajectories out of that system. Right, so let me pull some of this apart a little bit. So the system effects are important, right? And so what we have here is consider the recent report from the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's an experiment that works to get Fortune 500 companies to report their exposure to climate risk. Right? It highlighted how a number of heavy industry hitters are now including shadow carbon prices in their financial planning. Essentially, corporations like GE, Google, Microsoft, and even Exxon are assuming that there's going to be a carbon price in the future and including the cost of carbon in their business planning. Right? So this intervention, CDP working to get corporations to report their carbon risk, has altered the common sense of these corporate systems such that they are now anticipating a different kind of future. Right? So you get a normalization of climate policy. Interventions can also build capacity, the skills, tools, and institutions and knowledge to act. So the pilot programs in C40, this group of large cities, that they undertake around, for instance, retrofitting buildings or facilitating electric vehicles and designing transportation systems, provide knowledge and best practices that can be spread beyond the cities where they were started up. Right? And so you can get this buildup of capacity to act. Now, changing the common sense and altering the amount of capacity there is to act has a potential to have profound political effects when it comes to coalitions. Right? The potential is there for building political and economic coalitions that see that their interests lie in aggressive action on climate change. And as these grow, it will be essentially easier to move forward on larger and more ambitious targets. Right? Essentially what you're seeing here in coalition building is that one of the key problems in climate change is that losers from acting on climate change know exactly who they are and know exactly the level of costs that they're going to have to pay if we move aggressively on climate change, while winners tend to be more diffuse, right? And so these interventions essentially help to identify who the winners are going to be for acting on climate change and get them to network in a way that might lead to some political change. So these kind of system effects, these political mechanisms that the interventions engender, when they're successful, and we'll talk about conditions for success or are different in just a bit, lead to scaling and entrenchment, right? Scaling and entrenchment. Essentially, scaling up is a key for these interventions to have an impact that we might see as more than negligible, right? If they contribute to these dynamics, then we expect that interventions will scale up and become entrenched and catalyze broader change. But scaling is not just a simple thing. We do have simple scaling. Some of these interventions just get bigger, right? C40, started out as the C20, became the C40, and now it's still called the C40, but there's 68 cities in it, right? There's a growth imperative. Pilot projects in neighborhoods need to become citywide projects. The Carbon Disclosure Project needs to sign up most of the Fortune 500 companies if it's going to have the impact that they might like, right? And so we can talk about simple scaling as simply getting bigger. And if they're able to contribute to normalization, capacity building, coalition building, these interventions have the potential to get larger. They also have the potential to engender different kinds of scaling, something we call self-organized scaling and modular isomorphic scaling. And self-organized scaling is really kind of interesting. I think of this as building an ecosystem of action on climate change. Right? And so when you have an experiment or an initiative that comes in, it opens up all kinds of political space for other kinds of activity. So think about this in terms of the carbon offsetting markets. Right? Once you start to get people making carbon offset projects, well, what this did was it opened up all kinds of space for other initiatives. How do we verify these? How do we set standards for carbon offsets? How do we measure them? How do we account for them? And so once you get an intervention starting to work in particular areas, you can engender the growth of entire ecosystems of interventions that are working on climate governance. And we also see that we can see scaling beyond the initial cases, and that's what we're talking about with modular and isomorphic scaling. We have similar types of experiments multiply as either the model of the experiment is copied elsewhere or similar experiments pop up in different places, right? And so here what you have is the growth of city networks, for instance. You have multiple city networks that have emerged in multiple places, right? And so you also have the way in which different models of experimentation, so carbon labeling, for instance, once you start to get a working model of carbon labeling, and the Carbon Trust has a really interesting model of labeling products for their carbon footprint, that can get taken up by different jurisdictions. The Carbon Trust started a carbon labeling initiative in the UK, which is now being adopted with some modifications in France and Thailand and Quebec, right? And so you can get scaling outside that original set. We also see entrenchment, right? As these interventions have political impact, right, they begin to become locked in and self-reinforced. Essentially, you get increasing returns to the actions that we're talking about, right? And instead of talking about this in the abstract, I'll go through this in a little bit of an example here in just a little bit, right? But essentially, what entrenchment means is that once an intervention starts working, and if it's able to engender normalization, capacity building, and coalition building, right, that intervention becomes more and more part and parcel of the system that you're talking about. And it becomes how the system acts rather than something that is just disrupting the system, right? So now the arrows in this feedback that we're talking about here reflect positive relationships. In other words, as these three mechanisms increase, as we get more normalization, more capacity building, more coalition building, that leads interventions to scale up and become entrenched in the jurisdictions where they work, right? And over time, it is that relationship between the political dynamics and the scaling and entrenchment, we think, that helps to understand why a system might move towards reinforcement, improvement, or decarbonization, right? Now, this is just looking at the interventions in a particular system. And one of the things we're really interested in is how you can get efforts to disrupt carbon lock-in particular places, catalyzing effects of carbon lock-in in other places. And what we're excited about, and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback on, is we think that this exact same process is happening in basically any time you have an intervention working on carbon or working on decarbonization. This process is happening, but that they can be linked, right? And so that essentially what you have, the potential, because of the fractal nature of this system, because these are mutually dependent systems, that interventions, for instance, in Copenhagen, generate this kind of feedback relationship in Copenhagen, but also contribute to interventions and how the politics works in the state of Denmark, and how interventions work and the potential they have to disrupt things in C40, right? And so what we like about this framework is that it helps us to understand disruption of carbon lock-in in specific places, and the way that action on climate change in specific places can be catalytic elsewhere. And if people want me to go through that, I can, but I think it'd probably be more useful to talk about it in terms of an example, right? And so what do we do empirically? What we're looking at in this project, again, because we have no cases of decarbonization, what we're looking at is as many and as diverse a set of interventions as we can get, right? We're looking at city action, we're looking at state action, we're looking at national action, global action, private action. And what we try and do is take a look at what the target of the system is, right? They're trying to disrupt carbon lock-in in a city. Is it trying to disrupt carbon lock-in in an industrial sector? We try and trace, once the intervention gets started, how it's contributing to normalization, capacity building, and coalition building. We're trying to trace how that relates, or how that helps or hurts the intervention from scaling up and becoming entrenched, and then trace the links to systemic trajectories. Now, our goal in doing this is that last part, right? What we'd like to be able to do is translate our knowledge that we generate in steps 1, 2, 3 into strategies for how we might suggest, however humbly, what could be done to move systems onto trajectories towards decarbonization, right? And this is where we kind of know how to do 1 and 2, where we're learning how to do 1 and 2. We're really trying to figure out number 3, and we hope, this is probably a little bit hubristic, that if we figure out 1, 2, and 3 really well, we'll be able to do number 4, right? I'll come back in 7 years and tell you if we can do that, but we'll see, right? But how are we doing this empirically? Let me give you an example, right? And so this is the city of Copenhagen. For those of you that don't know, this is a famous part of Copenhagen called Nyhavn. And the reason I do this is one of our cases is the city of Copenhagen because they have a municipal climate plan in Copenhagen. The city of Copenhagen has a plan to go carbon neutral by 2025, right? And within that, it's not just a slogan, right? They have initiatives around energy, around buildings, around transportation. And they have a process in place where they're moving from pre-analysis in each of these areas to pilot projects to citywide implementation. Now, in most of their sectors that they're working on, they're still in stage 2 in pilot project area. But essentially, going along our empirical area, their plan is to disrupt carbon lock-in in the city of Copenhagen, right? And so what we do then is say, okay, they have a plan and they have a set of policies in place to try and disrupt carbon lock-in. How is that contributing to our political dynamics, right? How are they essentially, or what does that plan do? And so we look at it in terms of normalization. Right? Well, in terms of normalization, they have explicit stakeholder outreach, both citizen and corporate, to sell the idea of the sustainable city and economy. Right? The carbon neutral city is a livable city. The carbon neutral city is good for business. Right? And so they have active parts of their policy is to normalize the idea of a decarbonized city. Right? To actively engage with stakeholders to change the common sense around what a livable city is and what the city of Copenhagen should be, right? In terms of capacity building, this moving from pilot projects to implementation, they have an explicit learning by doing approach. City staff and stakeholders are both learning how to construct a carbon neutral city, right? Now this differs by sector. In the building sector, with retrofits, they're learning all kinds of really interesting things. They're learning how to bundle projects. They have an entire mapping exercise so that they know what types of buildings are where in the city because different types of buildings will require different kinds of retrofitting, right? They're also, therefore, getting construction companies involved in the pilot so they learn how to do retrofitting. And so they have the capacity to move beyond the pilot project to do citywide retrofitting. And of course, there's a political aspect to this capacity building as well, right? Learning by doing is good politics because it gets shovels in the ground, right? It gets economic resources moving in particular places. And of course, this contributes to coalition building, right? Development of a clean tech cluster initiative that complements the municipal plan is one of the things that really stands out in Copenhagen. They're explicitly selling carbon neutrality as a new economic model, right? And building economic coalitions that want to see Copenhagen move beyond pilot projects to citywide implementation. Right? Now, what we are seeing is that the contribution of the pilot projects and the city of Copenhagen's municipal plan to these political dynamics is leading directly to the scaling up of ambitions and entrenchment of this kind of action in Copenhagen. This plan has already survived a change of mayoral administration, and the initiatives are being funded. Now, I won't say that it's an easy fight at every budget meeting in Copenhagen, but they are being funded incrementally and growing, right? The city has taken over power generation, for instance, and is building windmills all over Denmark to offset its own electricity generation. And it's becoming part of the city identity. Right? If you talk to people in Copenhagen, this notion of a sustainable city being a livable city has become the new common sense on the streets of Copenhagen. And scaling up is occurring in the city as well as they move, again, from pilot projects to citywide implementation. Especially you see this in transportation with the bike infrastructure as well. Right? But perhaps more importantly, and if we think about this, so that's what's going on in Copenhagen. I can use this framework to understand what's going on in Copenhagen, right? But frankly, no one cares if Copenhagen decarbonizes. It'd be nice for the million people that live in Copenhagen, right? But that is globally negligible, shall we say, right? And so if Copenhagen is going to be more than a feel-good story and good for Danish people that live in Copenhagen, and I'm married to a Danish American who has all kinds of family in Copenhagen, and so it's wonderful for me. I get to go eat pastries and see wonderful windmills, right? But if it's going to be more than that, then we have to understand how action in the city of Copenhagen might catalyze efforts towards decarbonization, contribute to this kind of process elsewhere, right? And so we can also see this in terms of an external cycle, right? So in terms of normalization and capacity building, the city is actually undertaking a conscious outreach strategy on its own and through its participation in C40, the group of large cities where Copenhagen is a prominent member. Essentially, they're selling the idea of sustainable cities in their network, right? And the knowledge to achieve the disruption of carbon lock-in, they're trying to disseminate their best practices through the network of C40 cities. So this is happening on what I would call a city-to-city path, right? And this is propaganda from the city of Copenhagen, but I'll quote it anyway. Copenhagen is unique, large enough for its climate solutions to be interesting in an international context. Now that's promotional material, to be sure, right? But it's real policy within the city of Copenhagen. They're diffusing, C40 is essentially diffusing what Copenhagen is doing to the 68 members of the C40. This is also, this normalization and capacity building is also happening on a corporate path, right? One of the interesting strategies that Copenhagen has to scale up their ambitions within Copenhagen is to sell what they're doing in Copenhagen outside, right? They're really trying to sell this notion of the Danish economy as a clean tech economy, right? They're really trying to build coalitions of Danish corporations that buy into the green economy as a way to not only reinforce what they're doing, but to catalyze change outside it, right? And so you get this double action where selling the Copenhagen model actually ends up entrenching the actions within the city of Copenhagen. And so just last fall, Copenhagen and New York City announced a C40 facilitated partnership to establish a Danish clean tech hub in New York City. Right? And I'll just quote from the press release, that this will help New York City capitalize on Danish tech savvy while providing Danish companies access to the New York marketplace. Right? And so essentially what you've got then is, if city of Copenhagen is up on top there, that cycle is the city of Copenhagen. Well, the trajectory that the city of Copenhagen is on is having an influence on the political dynamics that C40 is also contributing to, right? And so because you have these modular systems that are mutually dependent, right, decarbonization efforts in the city of Copenhagen have the potential to catalyze or contribute to the political dynamics that are happening in other systems, right? Now, as you may have gathered from whether the confusingness of this framework is there's lots of work to do here yet, right? It's just beginning and we've got a number of cases on the go. Essentially what we're trying to do is learn as much as we can from a hugely diverse range of cases. And this is just the first 2 rounds of cases. We're eventually going to try and do about 25 to 30 cases, right? We're trying to learn lessons across them, especially on unintended consequences, the importance of resources, the importance of counter-coalitions, how the interventions adapt over time, right? And we're learning a number of lessons. We don't expect to come up with a set of conditions that are going to work across all of these interventions. In fact, that's not the point of what we're doing. What we're trying to do is come up with a way of understanding the process, or trying to come up with a general way to make sense of transformation, right? And we keep going back and forth between theory, empirics, and theory, right? But let me briefly conclude with the question of whether this is all worth it, right? I started off the talk by saying, asking what we have to work with and then quickly dismissing the multilateral process and sort of large-scale cost-benefit analysis reports. But it's a fair question to ask if studying relatively small-scale interventions or relying on relatively small-scale decentralized interventions is also a smart strategy, either in terms of academically or practically, right? And the way I think about this is I use a traffic jam analogy. I'm sure at least one or two of you have been stuck on I-95 at some point, right? And I don't know about you, but when I'm stuck in a traffic jam, the great temptation is to get off on the side streets, right? And try and go around it and try and find an alternate route, right? One of the reasons that is tempting, at least for me, and again, you guys are all probably more patient than I am. One of the reasons that's tempting, at least for me, is the illusion of forward motion is powerful. I really like to feel that I'm making progress, right? So getting off on the side street might be completely the wrong thing to do. It might be much slower, right? But I'm moving, I'm going forward, I'm dynamic, right? And so the worry, right? The worry is that concentrating on small-scale initiatives rather than putting our political efforts into trying to get a centralized national response or a centralized global response is getting off of I-95 and getting lost in the streets of New Haven, right? You're moving, but are you moving forward, right? I do, though, think, and let me end on a hopeful note, I think that analogy isn't correct. I actually think that getting off on the side streets is more appropriate because I-95, to really stretch this metaphor, assumes that there is one way to get to decarbonization, right? One way to get to decarbonization. And I think it's worth having a go, as this quote talks about, because decarbonization is not a single thing. Right? We are going to have to transform multiple systems at multiple levels in order to really move away societally and globally from fossil fuels. Right? And so thinking about how we can get disruptive change in specific particular places and how that disruptive change in specific particular places can catalyze broader transformation, I think is where our energy really needs to be, both politically and academically. And again, I'm speaking completely in my own interest because this is the project I want to work on. And so you can take that with a grain of salt. But with that, I will close and thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
So we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and if it's okay, I'm going to ask the first one.
Yeah.
So you're
No.
Sorry. You're talking about successful interventions scaling up and becoming entrenched. I'm wondering if you've thought about how things scale up and become entrenched when they are distinctly not successful, like the international negotiation process, which has been going on for 20 years and has not been a success, but I think most would agree that it's become entrenched and it's now, we're stuck in a traffic jam.
So let me talk about that in a particular way. We had a great PhD student, Hamish van der Ven, did a really interesting case on the carbon labeling, the carbon trust that I talked about. And if you look at the intended consequences of the carbon trust, right, that what they wanted to do was get product level carbon footprint labels on every product in the UK, right? And they signed up Tesco, which is the big supermarket there. They signed up Pepsi. They got all these people signed up. And then they realized that doing product level carbon footprinting is enormously difficult and expensive, right? And so Tesco dropped out, Pepsi dropped out, right? So if you just stop there, enormous failure. Did not scale up, right? But not all the products in the UK have carbon footprint labels, right? Didn't become entrenched. It wasn't that the UK said, yes, carbon product level labeling is what we need to do, right? And so, but failed intervention, right? System reinforcing, right? Except that if you look at what happened in terms of the unintended consequences, it was actually really interesting. And so companies that were working at the pilot phase on trying to measure their product's carbon footprint, right, found it to be enormously helpful in terms of finding where their most expensive emissions were. And they found them in really unexpected places. And so one of the examples that Hamish talks about is a potato chip company, right, did this analysis on where its emissions came from and found that they thought their biggest emissions was going to be transportation, getting the potatoes to their factory and the potato chips to the stores. But it turns out their biggest emissions were coming from the frying, and that's because of the way they were buying potatoes. They were buying potatoes on the basis of wet weight instead of dry weight. And so the incentive for farmers was to keep their potatoes in humidified storage, and so the potatoes were really wet, and wet potatoes take a lot longer to fry than dry potatoes, and so they're using a lot more energy to heat up the, you see how this goes, right? And so what's happened is that because of this move to do carbon footprinting at a product level, is what's scaled up is not that every product has a label, but what is scaled up and become entrenched in some corporate sectors is supply chain management are based around carbon, right? And that then has had the impact that other countries have started to ask the carbon trust, well, how did you get people to do this? And this is where the carbon trust methodologies for measuring these things are now starting to spread in a totally unintended way. Didn't scale up or entrench the way they thought it would, and it was a failed intervention for its intended consequences, but has generated some decarbonization trajectory from in an unintended way. Matt.
Yeah, well, thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation. I was reflecting, I was really intrigued by the metaphor of the fractal. Think about carbon lock-in. And one thing that the metaphor didn't quite capture for me is this notion that the degree of carbon lock-in is going to be the same in all parts of the system or in all levels of the system, right? Yeah. And so I guess I would have imagined that the parts of the system that are most locked in will also be the parts that are least likely to have a climate experiment. And so the question then is, like, should we be confident that sort of we can scale up from disruptive grassroots or below level type disruptions? Or might there be, I guess, also a need to have top down, right? So you imagine like the carbon tax in BC or BP, right? These are top down disruptions, right?
Yeah, well, BC carbon tax is really interesting. Is that top down or is that bottom up, right? It's top down in BC, but it's bottom up if you consider that it's a provincial action within a federal system, right? And so I think you're right that the fractal metaphor starts to break down when you talk about it doesn't break down, but it becomes more complicated when you talk about diversity in the sort of modular systems, right? Quebec looks very different than New York, and New York looks very different than California, and California looks very different than BC, right? And whether or not, I have to think about whether systems that are more locked into carbon are less likely to have sort of experimental interventions. I'm not sure. I mean, the United States is very locked into carbon, but it is one of the most innovative when it comes to the existence of experiments across the United States, precisely because there's been no federal action. So what you've seen is a fomenting of interventions and experiments at the local and state level. But the fractal, the part that's interesting is that where this breaks down some, let me see if I can, right, is that we don't know, you're absolutely right, that we don't know, that we think that carbon lock-in dynamics look similar in this cell as they do in this one, in the sense that they're, in the broad sense that there are reinforcing dynamics that make fossil fuels the default option. Now, the degree to which it's locked in is going to be different in these different cells, right? And the connection between them might be very diffuse, right? The city of Copenhagen is going to be very far removed from New Haven in terms of how what's the relationship between them, right? I don't want to take the metaphor too far, right? Mostly we think about it as both a justification for studying multiple systems, right? And a way to conceptualize the connection and mutual dependence between them. But in actually doing the analysis, we have to take into account the hugely diverse context in each of the cells of the fractal system. It's probably not a very satisfying answer, but we're working on it.
Can I follow up on that? I think this is a really interesting metaphor. I really enjoyed your talk. And it's pretty stimulating. I got a question for you about the metaphor. This is a metaphor.
Yes.
The question is, I was thinking, the dominant metaphor that you began with is the metaphor that the global commons problem, economists talk about how if one country acts somewhere else, it's irrational because it has no effect on the overall system, and therefore we must have a global treaty. And this is the whole Satan's argument, right? And you're saying actually it's the wrong metaphor. You're saying that this is the metaphor, and it tells us therefore there are things that can be done. It offers some kind of hope, right?
I was going to say, you're absolutely right. The atmosphere is a global commons. Emissions reductions is a commons problem. Decarbonization is not a commons problem.
Okay, so here's my question for you. I like this a lot that way. It helps frame things which are happening. Things are happening. Is it fair to say then that whereas the treaty-based approach, based on Satan's argument, is a very rationalist, economic, self-interested argument in scales, this one appears to be much more, the initial trigger is a normative one. Basically, you're having people care about the problem. And I'm wondering if that's true, like it's actually a different original motivation. Yes, you can bring all the different kinds into your model, but the original motivation appears to be some kind of normative orientation, right?
Okay, keep going.
If that's true, could it at the international level actually also be a place to spark these experiments? Okay, not through the traditional treaty-based approach, but through norm generation and so on.
Yes, and so I would push back a little bit and say I'm not sure that all of these interventions are entirely normatively based. In fact, I think we lose if it is. So I think that some of them, like some of the cities, sure, they have interested citizens that are pushing cities to do things, but some cities are acting because, Copenhagen is acting because they think it's going to be really good for their economy. Right, and other cities are working, the co-benefits for acting on some of this stuff are really important. And I think that it's actually easier to sell some interventions on the basis of co-benefits than it is on the basis of climate. But that said, I think a lot of the interventions do have that normative impulse behind them. And I think that you're absolutely right. And I always come across as being anti-multilateral, which is actually the first thing true. I would absolutely be the first one popping the champagne corks if Paris led to a really cool binding agreement. That it's not going to happen, but I'd be the first one cheering it, right? But I think that we have misunderstood what the role of the global level can be in climate change. We have this model in our head, and it's because of the multilateralism model, that when states face transnational problems that can't be solved within their borders, you set up a treaty that lays out the solution that they can all agree to implement. Right? That works for lots of different kinds of problems. It doesn't work for a problem as complex and as multi-level as climate change. But that doesn't mean that there's not a role for them. But I think we need to change our idea of what the role of the multilateral process is. I think it is a normative role. I think it is setting the aspirations high. I think that it needs to be more of a facilitating role than a solutions generating role. In other words, if Germany's working on renewables and Denmark's working on renewables, or we have 3 different subnational carbon markets in the United States, and we have 6 municipal level carbon markets in China, and we have the EU ETS, a role for the international system is to facilitate and coordinate amongst initiatives and to smooth out problems that happen because we have stuff happening in different places, right? And so you can have much more of a sectoral focus. You can have much more of a facilitating focus. You can have the global negotiation. The best thing that's come out of global negotiations the last couple of years was the agreement to go for 2 degrees, right? Even though there's no binding nothing about 2 degrees, but that has become part of the lexicon. That has become part of the understood aspiration of what we should be aiming for. And that becomes part of the motivation for acting on all kinds of these different levels. So I think you're absolutely right. It's just that we have to change our mindset about what are the possibilities for the multilateral process and what treaty making is good for and what treaty making is not good for.
enjoyed this fractal metaphor in the talk. It was I think it was a very stimulating concept at the heart of what you're working on. So the point where I found the theorizing weaker, and I'm telling you this because I think you can make it stronger, not because it's a problem, but given you're talking so much about being
That's a big assumption. But go ahead.
No, well, you're talking about scaling out, right? That you have some kind of innovation, let's say in Copenhagen, and the types of innovations you're talking about are many different types. So maybe some of them are technology, maybe some of them are policies, maybe some of them are behaviors. And what are the conditions under which these innovations, if we can use that term loosely, locally, actually scale out? Because it seems like there are conditions in which, like a technology, let's say Tesla invents a car, and then that car can be sold in a lot of other markets. That's a pretty easy spillover. But if China does a carbon market in one kind of way and Reggie does it in another kind of way, does that necessarily spill over? So I think thinking a little bit more about the types of changes that are happening and that ability to spill over to different places would be really useful, because I don't think all kinds of actions have that same spillover capacity, that some might be more locally constrained.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I don't know what the conditions are.
Yeah, I know you don't. So I'm saying, like, go figure that out. Then I want to read that.
But I want to complicate what you said a little bit there, because I want to be clear that I'm not talking about simple diffusion. It's not that what the city of Copenhagen is doing is going to be copied in New York and is going to be copied in other C40 cities, right? And so my theoretical answer to that is that what scaling out is, so scaling up is different. Scaling up is how things get bigger and more entrenched in the place where they started, right? But scaling out is a matter of how what you do in one place contributes to the political dynamics in another place. Whether it catalyzes the emergence of another intervention itself, right? And so that would be more of the self-organized scaling, right? Where you open up you do something and that opens up political space for someone else to do something, right? Or whether it contributes to how another intervention is already working, right? And the reason I say I don't have the conditions is I think that those conditions for when that's going to happen are awfully contingent upon the context within which that takes place. And so I think the best, because I'm not that smart, the best that I'm going to be able to do is understand this process, and the conditions that you're talking about are going to be contingent ones. And I'm actually okay with that. I think that it's okay for me, personally, if I can understand how, if the upper left is Copenhagen, how that generates interventions and how it contributes to the political dynamics of other interventions, right? And I might be able to get some contingent conditions, but that's going to be completely different, or not completely, it's going to be significantly different empirically. So if that upper left is Colorado's new energy economy, right? Contributing to, I don't know, maybe instead of Colorado's new energy economy, Wyoming's new energy economy, and also to maybe what Texas does with its already has renewable energy standards, right? So I think that the conditions I can tell you about is how what goes on in one contributes to the political dynamics in others. I don't know that I'm going to get to the point where I can say this is going to scale out when X, Y, Z are achieved. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe we will.
Or the object as well, right? The thing that's changing, because you started out by talking about UNRWA and sort of unpacking it and talking about different modes of carbon lock-in.
Yes.
Right? Like some are infrastructure, some are behavioral.
Yes.
And so I'm saying if you maybe think in those categories, you might get more of the
Yes,
conditions.
and that we're trying to do, and that's part of our case selection strategy, to be as diverse as possible. We're trying to look at ones from different sectors as well as different jurisdictional levels to try and tease some of that out. Absolutely. Thank you.
The one system trajectory you're not discussing is things going backwards. And unfortunately, I think we've seen trends that reverse themselves. One that's in the news is childhood immunization, where the rates actually declined over time. 20 years ago, climate was not a fundamentally partisan issue in this country. It is now. and that greatly complicates things happening at the national level. And I know it's not the case in Europe.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we're really, and so I'm conscious of the fact that I gave you like the hopeful story of how this could generate change, right? And I actually think that it's not the lower probability of them, but it certainly isn't necessarily how it always is going to happen. And so one of the things but I think you can use this framework to understand the generation of counter coalitions that do exactly what you're talking about. So if you have successful interventions, right, over time they scale up, they entrench, but that doesn't change, that doesn't mean that they are not susceptible to other interventions. So the vaccine one's really interesting. So essentially what you have with the vaccine one is we were locked into a system where everybody just understood that everybody should be vaccinated. But then you get an intervention that tries to disrupt that. You get Jenny McCarthy going on, and you get this terrible thing in Lancet that ended up being completely false, right? Generating the kind of political dynamics that would be counter coalitions to what we might want, right? And so I think that how this process plays out, so I think of it as providing a skeleton for how the politics is playing out, but then how counter coalitions develop, how you get adaptation of mission and even reversion, depending upon what you're looking at in terms of intervention, is a really important dynamic, and we're trying to think about that too.
So we have last question.
Oh, we had two people, so I'll take both of them and I'll try to do
So looking at some examples I'm a little familiar with, Germany and Copenhagen and the state of California, there's a tremendous amount of social capital and civic capital that's making this stuff possible. And Germany in particular, perhaps the government encourages cooperation among diverse sectors. Any lessons that you see in the C40 for building civic capital on state and city levels?
Yeah, I think, well, let me take the other one too, and I'll do them both at the same time.
Question
Okay.
in terms of how the underlying culture in the jurisdictions that come into play actually promote or facilitate the implementation of the decarbonization efforts that you're talking about. So, you know, you don't have to answer the question, but it comes to mind, is Copenhagen an egregious example, or is it a typical example?
No.
We have the case of the People's Republic of China, where you know, decisions are made in an entirely different fashion, and yet they're going forward.
Yeah.
And it's in similar, you know, to a certain extent it echoes the previous question.
And so I think that there's two parts of it, is that you can think of social capital or the underlying culture as both an impetus for experimentation, right? And so you're probably more likely to see the kind of experimentation and progressive or aggressive action in places that have that. And so it's really no surprise that it's Denmark, that it's Germany, that it's California, right? And so that's where you're going to see the generation of leaders on this. And you're going to start to see the pioneers in this, right? In C40, you have some cities that have moved very quickly. In fact, they're the ones that have found C40. And so in those kind of initiatives, the underlying culture or political and social capital ended up being generative of the intervention itself. More interesting and less clear answers is thinking about social capital, political culture as the end result of these interventions, right? So how do you build on, so you have a level of political capital or social capital that allows you to get started doing things. How, once you start doing things, does that build a normative community? Does that build a social and political community that wants to do more? And that's where, and so it plays this dual role. It's both an impetus and potentially an outcome from this kind of stuff. And we're seeing both of those. Like, if you look at the stories of, if I was just giving an explanation for, this is work that I've done before, explain why some jurisdictions have climate experiments and others don't, it's, you know, social and political capital and political culture is a key explanation for it. the key for this is to say, okay, that helps us understand the initial leaders in the fractal system. How does that then carry forward, and how do we generate those kind of social and normative communities from interventions? And that, we're seeing it happen. I don't know that I've got enough to give you very solid lessons on it yet. But thank you, this was fun. I appreciate it.